Welcome to the Growth, Grace, and Prosperity Podcast. Join Stewart Heath for down-to-earth conversations with top professionals, entrepreneurs, and leaders who have a story to tell. Let's get rolling.
Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Growth, Grace, and Prosperity Podcast. I'm Stewart Heath, your host, and we are joined by a fascinating gentleman, Andrew Van Breugel, who's had a fascinating career, and he's going to share those details with us. Andrew, thank you for being here.
Oh, Stewart, thank you for having me. It's great to join you on your podcast today.
Great. Let's get into it. Andrew, people have noticed that I tend to only interview people, let's just say, of a certain age, old folks like you and I and stuff like and not that young people aren't interesting, but they just haven't had the opportunity for as many experiences as people who've lived a little longer. And so when you think back, are there any moments in your career that you would say were game changers, made you pivot and go in a different direction?
Yeah, I think I've got to go back a long way for that one. But really, it was the decision to experience life outside of Australia, overseas. That was made back in the late 90s. So at that stage, I was still reasonably young, hadn't really fully embarked on my career, but I recognised the value, or I thought there was value, in gaining experience overseas, and not just from the work perspective, but culturally and socially. And in the end, we did that, and I had a couple of children. Well, I have two children that were born overseas, and of course that has impacted them as well, because they feel very much like I do, a child of the universe, if you will. Not Australian and not from Sydney and not a New South Welshman, but actually just a citizen of the world. And I think that decision made back in 1997, had a profound impact on me and my family and my work and my career.
So that's pretty much before the internet at that time.
Yeah, no, I do remember we certainly had email, and we had those modems that used to dial in through the phone system and make those funny noises, and then you would wait for it to get something. Not quite before the internet, but certainly I would say a little bit before it was definitely mainstream. Certainly before mobile phones were popular. They were around, but they were expensive and very large, and most people didn't have one. But yeah, it was a long time ago.
Yeah, I'm just thinking would have been like to even analyze such a decision like that before the internet, where right now we have a question, we just log in and type our question in and find out everything you want to know about Singapore, or that you can find out over that medium.
Yeah.
And how did you go about getting information about those, making that decision?
That's a great question. So you're right, internet wasn't really around to the point where you could, look up tax laws and cost of living and look at how much a car was and go online looking for rent. It wasn't at that standard. So a lot of it was fax machine, believe it or not. Email was around, so a lot of email, and phone call, believe it or not. So a lot of talking. The first country you moved to was Singapore, so it was in a similar time zone to Australia, so it was easy to talk with prospective employers, and rental agents, real estate agents, and anybody else I wanted to talk to. So a lot by phone and a lot of fax. But yeah, you look back, and at the time it seemed normal, but now looking back, you would think, yeah, how on earth did you do it? It's so much more convenient now. But we managed, and we used those traditional communication means.
Yeah, I would imagine you might have spent a little bit of time in your local library too, that would have access to resources back then.
Yeah, I was
Um,
never really a fan of
yeah.
libraries. I've got to be honest with you, Stuart. I had to go into them
Yeah.
sometimes because
Yeah.
I obviously went to college. But to be honest with you, no, it was just phone calls. Sometimes a fax had to be sent or something to some government department. My employer over there was very supportive, so they did all the heavy lifting as far as
Sure.
visas and things were
Yeah.
concerned. Yeah.
Yeah. I started my career as a auditor with Price Waterhouse, and before the internet, it was an
Hmm.
awful lot of phone calls and
Yep.
and going
Yep.
and seeing people and things like that. I remember. I remember.
Yep.
So everybody hits a bump in the road somewhere along the way. Maybe it's a health issue, maybe it's a layoff, maybe it's um, anything that you can imagine, or all of the above. Um, is there anything you can share that you've experienced and how you dealt with it in your career?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Stuart. I'm a fairly headstrong person, and I often have my thoughts about how something should be done. So, not all of my career experiences were smooth sailing, I have to say. But I suppose that the bump that you're talking about is, as I went about thinking about what my values were and what my beliefs were. Of course, you come across people who put their careers ahead of those values necessarily. And you meet these people that, they're doing very well, but they're only doing well because they're doing what the people above them want to be doing. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. But, this challenge that we all have, especially in senior roles, of to what extent do I do what I think is right, what I think is best for my organization, when there are others who may be influential who appear to be doing what's best for them. And again, that's I don't criticize that. That's just human behavior. But for me, the bump in the road has always been that challenge. I won't quite say falling on your sword. It's not that dramatic, but you've got to do things sometimes, or at least I do things sometimes that really aren't in the best interests of my career. Ironically, because I think it's in the best interest of the company that I'm working for. So that's not a single bump in the road. It comes up all the time, because it's based on people at the end of the day, and people are like that. So yeah, just managing that, balancing my values and beliefs with those of others is a challenge, I think, for anybody in a senior position.
I agree. The higher you get up, uh, the more important the decisions that we make are, and anybody with integrity, and you can have honest differences of opinion as to what's best. But yeah, it gets a little heavier as we get on. So um, I'm going to deviate from my usual next question because I am fascinated. You have lived many places around the world. Um, Before we started recording, you'd said, well, not all over the world, but yeah, from a guy who's lived pretty much his entire life in the southeastern United States, Australia, Cyprus, South Australia, Singapore, that's all over the world to me. And I would love to hear you speak about, you know, now you've been in Chattanooga for 4 or 5 years. Um, why Chattanooga, and what's that culture change been like for you and your family?
Yeah, so the story there, I'll take a minute or two to explain. So when I was in Singapore, I was a factory director. I looked after a number of pharmaceutical facilities for a US company called Merck, who most of your listeners would have probably heard of. Um, and then we had a gentleman come over from Lee University, which is in Cleveland, Tennessee.
Hmm.
He was teaching the MBA and senior business subjects, and they have this program where they would take students to different countries, and they would have to work on projects and work on real life business scenarios, and then do some charitable work somewhere in that region. That gentleman happened to be Dr. Guy Deloach, who was my business partner. So he came over a number of years, and we opened our factories to him and his students. And apart from work, we did a lot of stuff with the students and my staff, who were mostly obviously Singaporean or Malaysian or Indian. We played rugby, we played soccer, we did all sorts of stuff socially, and this went on for several years. And then I'm not quite sure what happened to the program, but it stopped at some point. Long story short, after several years, we teamed up to grow this business called Rock Creek Informatics, RCI, which is the business consultancy that we both own. And that is how I ended up in Chattanooga, because he, of course, lives in Cleveland, up the road. Culturally, for me, I can remember from being a little boy, the south of the US fascinated me. And it wasn't until I got here that I realised the South isn't really in the South. Actually, Tennessee is quite central, really, in terms of latitude. It took a while for me to but I always wanted to be in the South. I don't know what movies I was watching or what I saw, but yeah, I always saw these people sitting on the porch in the stinking hot heat with bugs flying around, and I just thought that's where I'd like to go. I'd like to, well, not just go there. I'd like to live there for some period of time. So I'm glad that of all the diversity within the US, I did end up in the South, which was like this big bucket list item from being a young kid. I couldn't live any further north because it's just too cold for my liking in winter. The west is nice, but the south, I like it here. I like the people. I like the food, the history too. And not all of the history is good. Let's be frank.
No.
But I'm fascinated by the history of the South, and I think it is truly that melting pot that you tend to think the US was. And it is distinctly different from Australia and the UK and every other English background country that I've been to. New Zealand, it is still globally unique, the South of the US, and even Americans think it's unique.
Yeah. Well, you're right about the latitude, but being in the South it's more of an attitude. So,
Right.
I have lived in the South my whole life, and I'm rather partial to it. And you're right, the history is not all good, but I doubt any culture has perfect history either. So,
absolutely. And there's nothing, history is something to be learnt from.
Yes.
It's not something to pretend never happened or wish it never happened or to bury it or whatever. It's there for a reason. It happened for a reason. History happens for a reason, and we have to unpack those reasons and learn from it and do better moving forward.
Absolutely. If you don't learn from it, you're going to repeat it.
Exactly.
Andrew, how do you tackle learning new things? I was just explaining to my younger kids the other day that I'm a CPA and I was getting continuing education, and they were shocked that I still go to school and have to learn things. And so, learning never ends. Sometimes I still resist it, but how do you tackle, as a senior executive, how do you learn new things when they come along?
So the amount of stuff to learn is obviously overwhelming, and it seems to be accelerating as things become more modern and information becomes more available. So I think what I try to do is I'm not so focused on the learning, but the how to know what to learn, right? So how am I going to make sure that the investment I make in education or learning, how am I going to make sure that is really going to add value And in my case, it's usually add value for a client. It's not necessarily
Right.
adding value for me. I mean, I do learn things for my own personal, needs. But usually we're learning stuff to do something better for a client. Whether it's a piece of legislation or a whole area of legislation, say in the defence sector, whether it's how an ERP system, a particular ERP system works, or let's say contemporary organisational design. These aren't things you necessarily learn in a course. So there's a lot of research that I do on the internet, like most people do probably,
Yep.
but that's got to have a purpose. I rarely do something just because I'm interested in it. I do something because I need to fix it. Just to give you a quick little example, now I'm having a bit of a problem with one of my cars, one of the family cars, and of course most people would just bring it to a garage and get it fixed, but I want to know why it's not working. So I had to discover, how relays work, what's circuitry on this particular problem I'm having in my car, then how to test the relays, and I had to buy some gadgets from AutoZone, blah, blah, blah. For me, that's learning for myself because I want to know why it doesn't work.
Absolutely.
So as I can tell the mechanic when he tells me what's wrong with the car, that that's actually not what's wrong because I've already tested that. But normally proper learning, yeah, we put that in the perspective of the client in the case of RCI because clients want us to do something for them because they haven't got the time or the interest to learn how to do it.
Right.
So that's
Right.
where we step in. And of course, my business partner is a tertiary institution teacher. So he is teaching and researching all the time new aspects of business and is obviously expected to teach that to his students.
Are there any particular types of things that you don't like learning new? And I'll start off with my own example. I am a lifelong learner, and I do enjoy gathering new information. But sometimes we have to learn things that we don't um, really want to learn, like a piece of software that I might have been using for 5 or 10 years, and they suddenly decide that they wanted to make it better. And I don't believe in fixing something that's not broken. But this is what software companies, and that just runs all over me that I have to now learn that again when I've got so many other things on my plate that now I have to spend time. Is there anything like that in your world that you have to learn but would rather not?
I can't really think of anything I hate to learn, but yes, the example you just gave, I'm not sure anybody particularly likes that. But it's not the learning that's the problem. It's the fact that the effort you have to put in to learn the new software doesn't result in any overriding value because whatever the
Exactly.
geniuses have done to
Exactly.
the software is of no interest to me. I don't see any difference. They just put things in different places. Now I've got to learn where those things are. And after I've done that, I'm no better off than I was to begin with. So it's not the learning that's the problem, Stuart. It's that I can
You're
get the
right.
value out of the learning. You know?
You're right. You're right. It's learning for no value. Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Is there something that I can't really put my finger on something that I really hate to learn? I mean, I don't like things, like getting a new phone, for example. Let's say your old phone breaks,
Right.
or you lose it or something, and so you've got to buy a considerably newer phone, and you've got to learn how to put everything back where it was. I mean, but again, why don't I like that? Because at the end of it all, I have a phone that was doing the same thing I had when before I lost it. So yeah,
Right.
to me, it's not the learning that's the problem. It's what the value you get out of the learning. And I think if the value was there, you'll never mind the learning, you know?
Right. Well put. Well put. You're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, I am learning a new piece of software that's going to give me new capabilities, and I'm finding that fun.
Right.
Yeah, it's when they've changed it for no upside. Yeah, well put. Well put. Um, Moving into the realm of personal business, and you're a successful executive, how have you handled, without specifics, but how have you handled managing um, your resources and your wealth outside of your entrepreneurial venture. If we're talking about stocks, bonds, real estate, whatever. What is your personal philosophy there?
Well, we can connect that to your previous question around learning. So I do all of my let's just say personal wealth management myself. I don't have an accountant and I don't have a wealth advisor. And I think that stems back to way back in the mid 90s. When I had purchased an apartment in a beachside suburb called Manly in Sydney. And then I purchased a second place in a suburb called Narrabeen. And I went to see a wealth advisor for the first and only time ever and talked to him about borrowing money against the equity in those properties. And he said, no, you don't want to do that. You want to pay these places off first. And I thought, that's probably the worst advice. I don't know if it was bad advice or not, but I ignored it completely. And my philosophy was, you know what? Provided I can service the interest, I'm going to borrow as much as I can all the time. And I don't think you'll get many people saying you should do that. But for me, it's worked out brilliantly. So I've always borrowed against my equity. And now we have a pretty handsome property portfolio back in Australia. And we have a decent amount of shares as well. Again, largely used, originally certainly, borrowing money to buy those shares. Now I'm not like what's the word? Irresponsible, with borrowed money. But the principle for me has always been very simple. If I can have an investment that will finance the interest, I will gladly take the capital gain. So with property, if you're in it for the long haul, that will almost, in Australia at least, that will almost always be the case. Now the US, I know, had some issues. It's poor prudential oversight in the not so distant past. Meant that you could actually buy a property for more than you would sell it for sometime later. In Australia, that's almost unheard of. I would say it is unheard of. So you will get capital gain by buying property in Australia. Now, if you're renting that property out, you're approximately getting, with all your other expenses, you're covering the interest. Even today in this high interest rate environment. So you're actually just working towards that capital gain. A capital gain is not cash based, so you've got to understand you need to have some way of financing those loans. But I'm talking back in the 90s, and I've been doing this since then. And now I have, we're doing quite well because of that philosophy. And we're very frugal with our spending, and that's something too. So that's something I think Americans need to learn, because Americans like to spend everything they have and then a little bit of what they don't have, and on things that are lunch, dinner, food, whatever, and I think if you really want to if you're a normal person like me, not Bill Gates or Donald Trump or whatever, if you're a normal person like me with a good job, you should be able to turn that income over pretty well, but not if you spend it all on stuff that doesn't add any value. Yeah. Right. That's a long answer to your question, but the philosophy is this. Nothing wrong with borrowing. Borrow as much as you can afford to borrow, right? Because how else are you going to build up your assets? You just need to make sure that these assets are secure and that they have some way of generating income, whether it's dividends through shares or rent through property, so that you are financing a good part of your interest expense from the cash returns on those investments. And then you wait 5, 10, 15, or in my case, 25 years. And if all those properties have doubled, you can only imagine what the capital gains are now. Now you've got another problem, and that is tax.
Right.
But there's nothing wrong with paying tax either, Stewart.
No, tax rate's never 100%. And so
the more tax you pay, the more you must have earned.
Yeah. when I was practicing, I used to tell my clients, I said, look, you should hope that you pay taxes because that means you made money.
Exactly.
Now we're gonna do everything we can to minimize those, but ultimately you want to pay taxes. Andrew, your advice there is very similar to what my own father told me. Borrow as much as you can afford, and so there's the real
Mm.
qualifier there. And what many times happens, and it's actually going on again right now, and this is part of what caused the last great financial crisis was lenders were loaning more than people could afford,
Mm.
and I think they bear no small amount of responsibility for that because you're dealing with financially uneducated people. That's partly their problem, but lenders knew better, and so they were lending money and selling those loans, and other people were left to hold the bag when it was
Yeah.
over. But it
Yeah,
is
prudential
that
oversight in Australia is far more rigorous than it is here in the US. So that situation really couldn't happen.
yeah, yeah, um, the qualifier is you've got to understand what you can afford, and you also have to understand that even great properties will sometimes go through a bad spot. Maybe 6 to 9 months of a vacancy issue, and you just got to be able to cover it. I'm a big believer in real estate, and we do an awful lot of it. Do you do anything with stocks, bonds, or anything like that?
Yes, not
401ks?
not with bonds. I never got into bonds, but I have a very active stock portfolio, which I manage myself. Those stocks are all based in Australia, though. I do have some here in the US, but I don't mess with those. I just leave them alone. But in Australia, which I think is well, maybe not so much these days, but it used to be a more predictable market, shall we say? Um, and investing was quite easy. Take the COVID crisis, the pandemic recently. Now you've got March of 2020, most markets dropping about 15 to say 25 or 30%. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to understand that that's completely unnecessary and unrealistic. These businesses are not worth 30% less than they were last week. Because now, at the very beginning, of course, there was a lot of people didn't know about the pandemic, but there were just as many organisations that would have to do well out of a pandemic as what would do bad. So I bought everything I could after that initial 30% whatever drop. I would have liked to buy a lot more, but I didn't sell enough. I didn't sell enough in time to free up cash to buy it all back 2 weeks later. But I released what I could, and I wouldn't say all, but certainly at least three quarters or 80% of those stocks have all done very, very well. Not because the companies have done well, but because it's just a stupid knee-jerk reaction to. So that's a good thing about markets. It's
Yeah,
basically driven by greed, and therefore, if you're not greedy, you'll generally do quite well out of things like stocks and bonds. Not so much. That's a different thing altogether. But stocks, it's driven by greed and fear. So as long as you're not
yeah.
greedy and you're not afraid, you will do well out of the stock market.
Andrew, if there was one negative advice you would give to somebody who wanted, maybe you're mentoring them or you're somebody who just wants to follow in your footsteps, what would that be?
Well, I wouldn't really recommend anybody necessarily following in my footsteps, but if they could take pieces maybe out of that. But I would say, look, if you talk about your prosperity in this particular case, yeah.
Yes,
So
sir.
start
Yeah,
early, right? Start early. Um, don't have this idea that, well, I'll go to college, I'll get a job, I'll get married, I'll have some kids, I'll buy a house, and then I'll start thinking about investing. Start early, live frugal, right? Because that $50 you spend on a meal when you're 25 years old by the time you're 60, that $25 could have been maybe 600 or 700 had you not spent it on that meal. Now, that's a sobering thought, don't you think, Stuart?
Right.
I'm not
Absolutely.
saying nobody go out for dinner. I'm not saying that. I'm saying think carefully about what you're spending
Don't
on.
do it every night.
Because, and that's particularly the message for my American friends. Why do you need to spend $300, $400 a week on food? I don't understand, right? Because that's $300 a week. That $300 is going to be something like $6,000, $7,000 by the time you're 65 that you've just walked away from. So just be conscious of that. So yeah, start early, spend wisely, and don't be afraid to borrow. I mean, but do it sensibly, because you can also get yourself into a lot of, well, here you can get yourself into some trouble because you can still borrow more than you can afford. Now in Australia, though, that's not the case. No one is going to lend you money that you can't afford to pay back. So you're looked after and protected by law and by the institutions or financial institutions. So if you've got spare money, the last thing, this is my most important advice. If you have anything in the bank, I want you to explain to me why. Why do you have money sitting in the bank? Obviously,
Right.
for your working capital, fine. But I tell my son, if I see your bank balance go above $6,000, $7,000, I want answers. Why? I say, oh, but I want a rainy day, this and that. I say, fine. There are investments where they're very liquid, right? If you need money and you can sell your shares anytime, even if you have to do it at a loss, right? They're still infinitely liquid, right? But why have you got money sitting in the bank that someone else like me or you, Stuart, is going to borrow and turn into something else? So that would be a few pieces of advice I would give.
That's fabulous. All of this has just been great. Kind of come down to the end now, Andrew. If anybody would like to reach out and find out more about you, maybe try to contact you, where can they find out more about you?
Yeah, certainly. If they'd like to know more about RCI and what we do as a company, they can visit our website at thinkrci.com. If they want to reach out to me personally or for any other reason, they can find me on LinkedIn for sure, Andrew Van Breugel. So you'll be able to find me on LinkedIn and connect to me that way. But if you're looking to write an email on anything to do with our business operations, yes, our website's the best place to go.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone in the audience for watching this episode of the Growth, Grace, and Prosperity podcast. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope everybody will tune in again for our next episode. Take care till then.
Thanks a lot, Stuart. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to the Growth, Grace, and Prosperity podcast. If you'd like to be a guest, visit growthgraceprosperity.com/guest. We'd love to hear your story.